Wonderful. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the 55 Plus Entrepreneurs Workshop session on basics of entrepreneurship, everything you wanted to know about this amazing topic and why we're all here. I'm Rebecca Hughes, a member of the board for the 55 Plus Entrepreneurs and your MC today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. If you have questions during the session, you can put them into the chat box, which you can access from the chat icon that may be at the bottom of your screen or sometimes at the top in Zoom. We'll be taking questions also during the call if you have any and at the end. If you're having technical difficulties, please put a note in the chat and we'll try to help. With that, and on behalf of our co-founders, Sylvia Bonatti and Annabelle Reitman, I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Wayne R. Curtis. Dr. Curtis met Sylvia when they were both working at the University of the District of Columbia, where he was teaching entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship to both undergraduate and graduate students, and served as the acting director of the Center for Urban Entrepreneurship. Dr. Curtis has worked in the financial services and economic development arenas in New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. for over 45 years. He's created financing products for the public and private sectors, served the mayors of Philadelphia and New York as an economic development advisor, and serves as the board chair for the Mentor Capital Network, supporting social entrepreneurs who are building companies where mission drives margins. In 2007, he became a managing partner at Curtis Concepts, LLC, a full-service advisory firm offering financial advice for real estate deals, including structured finance, management consulting, and professional customer relations. Dr. Curtis is a graduate of Harvard University and received a Master's of Science in Urban Planning from Columbia University School of Architecture and Planning. He holds a PhD in Leadership and Change from Antioch University and currently serves as the adjunct professor at the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning, and Historic Preservation. Dr. Curtis, it is our tremendous pleasure to be with you today.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank all of you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about one of my favorite subjects. And I think one of the most important things that we should all grab and embrace and try to get generations to do, because quite frankly, entrepreneurship is really how we all got here today. I have a deck that I'm going to go through, but I don't really want to do this like I do the students in my lecture rooms. I'd much rather have a dialogue, get questions as we go along, have you stop me if I say something that either doesn't make sense or even if it sounds absurd. And that way we can sort of make the most of this time we're going to spend together. So now let's see if I can do this part right. There we go. So I have been in and around the world of entrepreneurship since pretty much the late 70s to early 80s. And if I were a baseball player for baseball fans, I would probably be batting about 238. And I'm not sure what that gets you these days. Probably not one of those $400 million contracts. But I've failed more than I've succeeded, but I've succeeded in every failure because I've been able to take those lessons learned to the next venture. And I've been able to focus on everything from some pretty basic ideas to some pretty high tech ideas. So, how do we get to this? We all generally understand what entrepreneurship is about. I always start with what I call knowledge gaps. What do you currently think you know? What is it that you don't know, which is more difficult, obviously? And what is it that you would like to know? When you start to put that puzzle together, you begin to find where gaps are. And when you start to think about the team that you're ultimately going to put together, those gaps get to be filled by those types of individuals. And it depends upon the nature of your product or your service what those gaps might be. Um, Throughout this conversation, I'd like to really highlight some ideas, even challenge some of them along the way, but also spend some time sharing with you what I believe are some fundamentals that take place in out all of entrepreneurship. I picked this slogan up. I'm not sure where, but innovation is all about identifying and meeting unmet needs. When you think about it, that's the essence of a product or service that makes a lot of sense. Now, Apple, of course, turned some of that on its head because it convinced the world it needed an iPhone more than it needed anything else. And they've done a great job keeping that up, and they're up to 13 or 14 iterations. But nonetheless, that need has been filled, and sometimes people aren't even aware that they have that need, but they were one of the first to sort of make that happen through that approach. We always start with what's your idea? And this is where one of my favorite books, Simon Sinek, asked the question, why, comes to mind. And it really is important because even with your idea, you have to ask yourself, why is someone else interested in your idea? And as you brainstorm that with that, and maybe even go as far as have think groups put together to give you some feedback. This question gets addressed a lot early on because it's very important. The second one is can be a little confusing. It says, do you have an unfair advantage? That's really a nice way of saying if you were the first one to invent sliced bread and nobody else had, you would have an unfair advantage until the competition figures out how to slice bread as well. And as long as you have this unfair advantage, you will continue to gain and grow market share and be in the lead. But I assure you, people are constantly figuring out ways to try to topple your unfair advantage. One such circumstance that I became aware of a couple of decades ago, there are people that go to the U.S. Patent Office on a regular basis and they look at ideas and try to look and see if there's a way that they can take an existing idea and or patent and with whatever the appropriate modification make it effectively a new product. And they do this all the time. There's nothing illegal about it, but they still have to meet certain hurdles. And that's another whole discussion just talking about patents alone. This next one, really, I borrowed from a publication called Lean Startup. What is your MVP? And this really is about what's the minimum you have to do to your product or service in order to test it in the market to see if someone really is interested in what it is. It's a way of doing an iterative process. Let's say I was in the t-shirt business and I want to make t-shirts with a big smiley face on it. That's an original idea. And I decide to just go out on the street, maybe put up some t-shirts and ask people as they walk by, well, what do you think of this t-shirt? Would you buy this? How much would you pay for this? If it were in different colors, you start to ask a range of questions that start to shape and give you the feedback to know that, well, maybe if you get a lot of interest, maybe you hit that minimum. If you get a lot of, I'm not sure, then you got to go back to the drawing board. And that's part of one of the issues you start to deal with early on. The third bullet is slightly ahead of where it should be right now because you don't need to worry about a break even point until you have a product that people are willing to sell. But I put it here because it's an important part of the discussion. These are other concepts that have come from any number of publications, many of which you'll be referred to later on in the deck. Pivoting. You hear it if you're a basketball person, what it means, but in the business world, it really means, let's say you were in banking and you specifically were in the mortgage industry. Well, as rates have gone up some 160 basis points over the last 12 months, or 1.6%, the demand for mortgages has declined. So, in order for you to keep your business going and profitable, you have to pivot or change your strategy, your product strategy to try to continue doing business. That may mean you want to start marketing home equity lines of credit. So, for those people who already have a mortgage, maybe they want to take a line of credit against the equity that that particular loan has. So that's what pivoting is about. When you suddenly find that your particular line of business no longer is in demand, you pivot or change your strategy to address the circumstances. There are a number of individuals and research supports this, that failing fast is important. You probably um, heard the phrase paralysis, or analysis by paralysis, or paralysis with excessive analysis. That's just something you can't do in the business world. And many argue that it's important to fail fast, learn from that, and go back to the drawing board and see what it is that you need to do differently. And there are people on both sides of the aisle regarding this particular point of view. Continual learning is something that's part of it. I think it's part of most of us, um, whether you're in business or not, but it's particularly important in the business world as things are changing. The digital technology that has been around now for 10 to 15 years has made it very different. Social media has made how you reach your customers, identify markets very differently. And so you've had to learn new things. Many argue that artificial intelligence is the next big wave that's going to require another learning curve for you to see how I can align that with your business values and approach. And I really am a big customer of valuing customer input from the very start of your business. I'm a little annoyed that every time I pay my phone bill, they ask me, how was your experience in paying your phone bill? That to me gets a bit much because I'm not quite sure what to say to them other than it's still too high. And that obviously isn't very valuable feedback because they're not going to give me a discount because I think it's too high. But I do think when the previous slide we talked about going out and finding your MVP, minimum viable product, that's where you are getting that initial input before you go to production or a final approach. Let me pause for a moment and check in and see if anybody has any questions or thoughts so far.
So, Dr. Curtis, this is Rebecca. One question here is when you're testing the market, this I think was on your last slide, there's a natural tendency to probably go to your friends and family for feedback first. And the question is, would you recommend not to do that, or it's okay to do that, but you really need to make sure that you're getting feedback from people not related to you that you don't know, like going to maybe a local library or a farm market or something, depending on the type of product or service?
Invariably, that's a good question. Invariably, you have relatives and friends that are negative. Identify who they are and make sure you take the idea to them because they will find something negative to say, and that's okay because you don't need bobbing heads, which some friends and families are tends to do, which is tell you that's a wonderful idea, that's great. That's not very helpful feedback. You need tough love early on. And so I wouldn't load up with friends and family, but I would definitely load up on my sour uncle who always seems to find something wrong with everything, or my younger sister who finds a critique no matter whether the sun is out, she'll say it's going to rain any moment. That individual can actually be helpful because it's like sales. One of the first things you learn in sales is how do you overcome the objections, and
Mm,
that's what you're looking for is early objections as to what's being said, because sometimes it's valuable. Sometimes it's so extreme, it gives you food for thought, but it also gives you room for looking at it. But the other idea of going out on the street, literally, and we'll actually try to look at one of those exercises in a moment, is really going out to the street and asking strangers what they think. Most people will actually give you feedback as long as you're not trying to sell them something right then or asking them to donate to your favorite charity. People are quite willing to give you feedback. So you want a little of both.
everybody loves to share their opinion.
Yes.
And there's a follow on. This might be something you're going to talk about later, so feel free to hold this one. Um, uh, when you were talking about failing fast and starting over, and I'm not sure, I'm going to try to summarize this quickly, but how do you tell maybe if the foundational idea is actually something you do need to just walk away from versus something that you're tweaking? So this is kind of that next step of, you mentioned getting some really serious, intense feedback and that makes you think twice. Is there, are you, or will you talk about, or is there a way that you can maybe identify that as an entrepreneur to say, "Ooh, this, this is something that I really believe in, but I'm just not getting that feedback from the market." Like, what point do you stop trying to find people to validate it that you should do it?
Well, so if in your first venture out to get ideas and feedback from people about your idea, every single feedback is no, negative, no way, you have to ask yourself the next question of them. Tell me why you feel that way, because that's the data that you're going to need to get to the continual learning part. Because if they say to you, you live in the desert and having an ice cream stand in the middle of the desert just is not going to work or not be cost effective, then you can start to figure out why. And then you can do more research and say, well, if I spend X dollars on a refrigeration system, I could really make it work. Well, the dollars and the economics will really tell you why that particular idea may not work. And you just then have to rethink. I still want to do ice cream. Maybe it's a location issue. Maybe it's a really cost issue. But the failing fast is feedback that you'll get and that you'll have to. Again, here's the more the qualitative feedback because there's no need to start running numbers immediately because if it's not something that people are reacting to, you need to understand why they are not reacting to it in a positive way. And it may take you two or three approaches to it. It may be the color, it may be the fabric, it may be the market that you're targeting. But you need to know what the negative is in order to figure out is it just I fundamentally have an idea that doesn't make sense? Or is there some way I can tweak this idea and do that? So, I mean, a really obvious one, and don't mean to be glib about this. As a financial planner, the last thing I would do is go into the poorest neighborhood of the city and try to sell financial planning products. That's one clear way where you know that it's not going to make sense. Most would know that going out the box, but maybe not always. I hope that helps.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. That's all we have for now.
So, fundamentals of idea generation. Ideas come from everywhere. When for a time, I got a chance to work in investment banking for about 16 years. And early on, I really wanted to understand how markets work and how to invest. And I was so anxious to get involved in this. I'm actually one of six children raised by a single mom and public assistance back in the 50s, 60s. And so I just couldn't wait to make my mark in the financial world. One of the things I started to really watch was we have three children, was watch the kinds of toys, activities, and clothes that they attracted to, and started researching my early investments around those activities and those companies. And turned out many of those companies follow those kids, and they do it now as they start to grow, and they figure out a way to market to them. So that was just one of my off the cuff ideas about how to enhance my investment ideas. They didn't all work, but I was doing pretty good with it, and it turned out fairly well. The other way to generate ideas is listening. Got to be a really good listener and think about things that you would make your life better or easier. Most ideas really come out of necessity. Some obviously are not necessary. I mean, you clearly, not everybody needs a $25,000 Rolex watch. That's another whole market and another whole dynamic. But what's the fundamental of the idea? And this goes back to Senec's comment, why? Why this idea? Why now? And timing sometimes can be a big difference. Um, I was involved in the late 70s with a company called Software Statistics, SoftStats, and we had the first fully encrypted machinery that was software driven that turned an analog signal into a digitized transmission. And when I say this to people, they look at me and says, "Oh yeah, sure you did." Well, sure we did. But what we didn't have is we didn't have the pockets, we didn't have the strategy, we didn't have the timing to do this in 1978, 1979. We just weren't there. And it's not something we invented, but digital is everything now. You talk about you're at the head of the curve of digital. Yeah, sure. And, but we were, and we still have the the box of papers in my basement that I don't know why I still have. But timing sometimes can be something to think about. And I would say right now, for example, um, there are a number of people that have figured out how to help people plan and do events post COVID. So meeting planners have changed their approach around you could have a nice event, have fewer guests, more spacing, more spaces within, say, a museum, more spaces within a facility that give people the comfort to have the interaction but not feel all crammed up. But ideas can come from anywhere. I listen to children. I listen to conversations while on the mass transit, while I'm traveling through the airport. And the other thing I still do is I keep a notepad and pen next to my bed. And I try not to wake up in the middle of the night trying to write ideas down. It's not very good for your marriage. But I do try to capture those ideas first thing. So idea generation can come from everywhere, and no need to act on each one, but start to keep a good legend about the ones that do come up. And back with the other idea generation, I used to tell a lot of the students I taught that be real careful about also about how you share your ideas, because there are people who are willing to steal your ideas and take and run with it. So you've got to be able to how do you get feedback, just enough information so that someone can't take your idea and run with it. So having talked about this is where lean startup and traditional business plan approaches conflict, because traditional business plans require you to do an executive summary, research the market, try to figure out how much capital you're going to need to enter the market. What's the competitive environment about? Your due diligence around principles and terms, and you take this and you go out and try to raise money. Well, venture capitalists and funders, and I'm an investor in businesses. I read first the executive summary, that first 2 to 5 page summary before I read the other 35, 40 pages attached to it. And you've got to be able to capture my interest and my investment preferences within those 3 to 5 pages. And a big part of that, of course, be sure you research and pitch your ideas to the appropriate audience. If you know someone is a specialist in healthcare and your product is around automotive parts, it's a waste of their time and your time to pitch your automated parts to someone who's only interested in healthcare investments. But I still support business plans. I support a more summary approach. And I also like some of the lean startup models, which sort of says, before you go through all that, let's take a piece of paper and we'll actually, I've borrowed from the lean startup publication their little template for us to talk about. But business plans are still how people make investment decisions because they want to know, what is your idea? What's your competitive in market? What expertise and team do you have to do this? What resources are you bringing to the table? And what's the next phase? Because if you're a one trick pony, nobody's really interested in that. But they are interested in, you said you're going to get into mortgages. Maybe the next phase is doing home equity. Maybe the other phase after that is rental properties. But there's got to be something that's got to attract it, and you need to understand who your investing audience is. And there again, this is about doing your homework and why plans are useful.
Dr. Curtis, we have a question.
Go right ahead.
Um, so there's a is there a way to protect your idea before it becomes a business? Or if not, at what point in the business formation process can you legally protect yourself?
So there is a thing called a NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, which details exactly when you share the idea in written form with someone, you have them sign this, and it legally binds them to not talk about it with anyone other than you, unless you give them permission to do so. So that's what the market traditionally does. Other than that, you pretty much have to be very careful. If you don't get an NDA, somebody says, "Well, I'm not going to sign an agreement until I see what your idea is." My gut tells me, well, why not? And so that's the legal approach to locking down someone to not talk about your idea or share it with anyone else without your permission is an NDA. Beyond that, you have to be very careful in how you put it out into the universe.
So if I could follow up on that, I'm actually a procurement, my background, I have a procurement experience myself. Um, and one of the things that I know I would have a question if I were doing this is when I was working with the government and other companies, we have attorneys on staff that would do the NDAs for us.
Mhm.
But now there's a lot of products out there that you can get a kind of a DIY, you can get a template or something like that. Um, so it made me think about, do you have any advice on when you have something like an NDA, which is a legal binding agreement,
Mhm.
would you feel comfortable to use one of these DIY products, or would you advise it's really worth it to actually engage an attorney to help you at that point?
There are a number of NDAs that have that you can buy through. I use a legal template. I pay per usage to get a document that has been vetted. And depending upon the level, like for example, I have some rental properties in Ohio and Tennessee, not mansions. They rent from 600 to 900 a month. And so I went to a DIY site legal for a lease agreement for the state of Tennessee and Ohio, and I was comfortable in using that. But I have a client that's in the market now trying to raise $120 million. I assure you, the NDA that's associated with this fundraising
Yeah.
is pretty thick, and there are a lot of lawyers on both sides. So I always say it depends. I mean, what level are we talking about? Um, how likely is the person you're sharing it with? Is they're trustworthy? But I really just sort of find that you can do some very basic NDAs that you can buy templates from, and you also will find a lot of young attorneys who are willing to give you some legal advice if you're willing to commit that as this thing takes hold, you will come back to them as a highly likely lawyer that they will use going forward. There's a way to bargain these things. I mean, the high the $1,100, $1,200 law firms won't even listen to you for that conversation. But there's a lot of good legal talent out here that will.
That's very cool. I never had heard or thought about that. So thank you for that. Appreciate the
Sure.
follow-up.
So we've really kind of talked about this already. Sort of how do you test your concept? There are a number of platforms that exist. Most of which, that when I've showed up in the last few years, I recognize I'm probably 3 times the age of the average person in the room. And once I get past that, I talk about pitching the idea. I had a blockchain idea at the end of 2018, early 2019, where we were going to use blockchain, which is in the simplest form, is a way to identify someone objectively, legally, and with technology, so that no matter where they go or how you interact with them, that ID follows them. And I wanted to use it to help people who were going to check cashing companies to cash their checks, because the fees alone are staggering. I mean, I won't even bore you with the details, but check cashing charging you 2.25% just to cash your check. And I found a bank that was willing to, that believed in this technology ID, as it were, as a way of saying, ah, yes, I can validate that they work. I can validate they have a W-2, paycheck, steady work, and their employer is willing to sign an agreement to pay the loan they get from me or the income they get from me directly from their paycheck. So we had this thing all set up. We had it all lined up. We had uh, like 200 individuals lined up who were valet parking people, wanted to do this, all working for the same company. And COVID hit. And so even when we had tested our concept, we had vetted the idea, we had got an agreement, we got a company to do all this. We had a concept that made sense. We had tested it that it made sense. Suddenly, instead of paying 11 and 12% to get money effectively, they were getting it from 5.5 to 7%. Big difference. But there's an example of we tested the concept, we vetted it, we got participants, and circumstances changed. People weren't valeting their cars during COVID. But there are other ways to test your concept. And um, but let's go all the way back to the friends and family. Hopefully, they're truly your friends, and your family does care about you. That's a good way to start the conversation, and you'd be surprised how much information there is out there in the market.
We have a
Sure.
question. I'm not sure if this is the right place to answer it, so just let me know. If you have an idea, like you see a need, and you've validated that concept resonating with people, but you personally don't have the expertise to start the business, like you talked about blockchain as the example here.
Mhm.
Um, is there a way that you can recommend how to find a partner that has that expertise or how you would do that? And if you're going to address that later, we can hold that.
No, it's just now. I mean, from the outset, when I talked about putting together the gaps of knowledge, know what your gaps as an entrepreneur, what you're able to do. Some people are great at managing people. Some people are great at technology. Other people are really organized and can put systems together that make sense. And you need to figure out which pieces you have and which ones you don't, and there are ways to network. I mean, that's where social media can really become valuable, is helping you identify, I'm looking for someone that writes code around X. And you'll get a lot of stuff, so you got to be careful, because Google, you say what color is the sky, you get a billion hits. You don't want that. But there are resources and networks. Some of the books you'll see at the end of this presentation are helpful for that, and others are helpful. And when I was first started, for example, blockchain, I assure you, I am not the tech person in any way. But I went online, I contacted people from my alumni schools I've gone to, and I identified a dozen different people who really took the time and patience and gave me resources to understand it. And I was able to identify two people that became part of our development and business team. But it's going to require you to doing some vetting, some researching, because there are also some people that showed up and they would say words I didn't understand. And then I would say, yeah, but that sounds so good. So what would you do if you did this? And they would suddenly look at me and they wouldn't understand it. But it was, I had friends give me a set of questions that anyone who had the purported expertise should be able to answer. So it's going to require some digging and some vetting, but networks, and that's where the social media piece really becomes helpful and can cut through what we used to have to do, either with Rolodex, if any of you are old enough for that, and or going through phone books. But there is, trust the networks you have, and if you don't have their networks, there are all kinds of communities that exist on primarily Facebook or Google that I use. I don't have TikTok or Instagram or the other ones. So that's what I would do to use that. And you know, alumni networks are always good ones, because you have this natural connection with someone that finished the same institution that you did, or grew up in the same neighborhood, and that's a good place to start.
And I'll throw in here a pitch for our own organization, which is actually one of the reasons that we started this, or I should say Annabelle and Sylvia started this, is to create a community of entrepreneurs, of like-minded people, in an incubator kind of model, because that's also a way uh, to bring people together who are like-minded, as you say.
Mhm.
So that's also what we're trying to build over time. Of course, we're just getting started, which
Sure,
is why we're starting with this.
sure. One of the organizations that was pre-COVID wildly successful was WeWork, which provided a desk in a room full of desks in a warehouse like space, where all these entrepreneurs were doing different things, but it created an environment that was infectious. They shared ideas. They'd find somebody who was who specialized in design or artwork, or they met someone who put together websites, and so that was a natural or organic way that people reacted and actually found resources. And there's some of that that still goes on, and I think some of that WeWork type community workspaces will catch on again. um, but they are there, both actually or virtually.
Excellent. Thank you so
Sure,
much.
sure. Refining your concepts. This is another way of continual learning. You see the little lines in back there. There's but business plans, ideas, all kinds of maps and teams and searches. Just a brainstorming mechanism about this. And I think that I was actually surprised that TikTok didn't do a better job at defending what its product has brought to the market. There are several entrepreneurs who have actually used the platform to put forth their idea, and they've actually generated business that people have contacted them from it. And some have actually grown their business. So it is a platform like that to get, and people get feedback when they were doing their ideas. There are other ways I'm told, but I don't know this personally, that podcast is another way to float an idea and really see if you had a concept that makes some sense. I co-published a book in the fall of 2019 around the knowledge economy. And we worked with some other researchers and we started to ask people, well, what is the world of work going to look like 10, 15 years from now? And everyone we talked to, it was all around knowledge. And that if we didn't figure out how to get more people to be more knowledgeable, you're going to have a big chunk of society that's outside of the success bubble because we're going to have an economy driven by knowledge. And AI is only going to accelerate this. Um, our publication got published. Of course, there's nothing like publishing a book in the fall before a COVID panic because we didn't get on the road, pitch our ideas, or pitch our book, but we still got the book. We actually are talking again about, well, how can we refine that concept again into either another publication, or is there a business idea about how do we get people to embrace knowledge more and not to be afraid of it. I get a lot of pushback from my students that I'm constantly giving them articles that are relevant today of what we're talking about. I'm constantly pointing them to resources. I'm constantly asking them to interact with each other about brainstorming ideas because that's really where you get to develop and nurture these things through that constant interaction. And some of that constructive friction really results in a way to refine your concepts. So this is the document. It's not mine. Hopefully, I've properly documented where it came from at the bottom. This is one of the tools that the lean concept used. And this is on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. Literally, you get this much space to put your entire idea on it, from the problem you're trying to top three problems, what customers are you trying to identify, going back to the unfair advantage, like you've invented sliced bread before anyone else, and other people haven't figured out how to slice it, so you have this unfair advantage. How will you get this particular thing to people? How will you make money? I always ask students who have these great ideas that says, how will you get paid for this problem you've identified, the solution that you've come up with, and these customer segments that you identified? And what's your unique value proposition? Because if you just have another shoe that doesn't bounce higher, run faster, then you just have another shoe. You have a lot of shoe companies that have come in the market in the last 10 years who have a unique proposition that for every shoe you buy, they donate a pair of shoes to some underprivileged community. That caught on with a lot of people in a lot of ways. One of the books that, pardon me, turning away, that I uh, took around, I don't see it in front of me, my apologies, is this guy who did the tea. Forgive my back. So it was Honest Tea Guide. I had a chance to actually interact with Seth Goldman before. So they started with tea, and they started looking for teas in different parts of the world. I mean, they really spent 2 or 3 years trying to figure out how to make it affordable, taking sugar out of it. And he did a book called Mission in the Bottle, which I didn't put in my list, but it's easy to find. and it was also presented in a different way. And it was really a honest guide, honest tea, guide to doing business differently and successfully. So his unique value proposition is, what if I can give you quality tea from markets where people are being paid real market value for their tea and not beaten down by the distribution channel, and we're bringing it in fresh, and that was their unique proposition. Then of course you got to have metrics. If you can't measure it, I don't know how you track it or determine it's successful. There used to be a slogan, excuse me, years ago that one of my managers says, "You are what you measure." Because if you can't measure it and you can't track it, you won't be able to figure out when you're successful. Your cost structure obviously will impact your revenue stream, and you can see that dotted line in the middle is about products and it's about market, and between the two, and this is an exercise that you can do, that for free, costs you nothing. And if you can see how far you can get with this, it'll give you a good idea, going back a few slides, about how do you vet an idea, how do you flesh out your idea. Try filling this out, and see how far along you get. There's actually obviously a whole book and publication around this, which you can probably get it from the library, or probably pretty expensive now. So this next slide's really, I'm not going to obviously go to each one of them, but they're books that I've tried to say, I've broken up, and these are my categorizations. How do you get the creative juices flowing? How do you talk about ideas? And this is the Simon Sinek. How great leaders inspire everyone to take action is really what the basis of the book is, but it's also about how do you develop a product and a business idea. The lean startup obviously is one I've referred to more than once. And of course, iterate a plan that works is a sort of a spin-off on that same idea. The other resources I have here, this is sort of Clifton. It's from the, oh, I blew this again. It was the survey company, which Rebecca is going to remember while I stumble through this, because they do a lot of national surveys, and Jim Clifton is part of the family that does this.
Would that be the Qualtrics product? Are you thinking of
Uh,
survey?
no, they're down, actually right down on M Street. I cannot believe it. I believe that. So
Oh,
I know. Here we are. Let's see here. Uh, Gallup.
Gallup. There we go.
Gallup. There we go. So Gallup actually did this first book. Jim Clifton is from that group. And the second book was actually, or the third one is another one of the Gallup products, is a first break all the rules. I mean, it always sounds nice and easy to say. And I think that's why I was able to spent a lot of time during my corporate years asking for forgiveness, because permission just took so long. Um, I like Mariotta's approach to this, the Entrepreneur's Manifesto. I think is a good reference guide to look at it, and the Steve Blank and Bob Dorf's book, the Startup Owner's Manual, is another great one to again begin to root ideas. So what I think is important to get you into what I call an entrepreneurial mindset. And the reason that's important is because you need to be in the right frame of work. I'm trying to write my memoirs, and I've been writing notes in books for now 3.5, 4 years. And I finally, the other day, said, I can't write any more notes. I'm ready to write the book about my life, because I think it's been very blessed and wonderful. Now, it may be like my book on the knowledge economy, where um, my what I say, the revenues from it have been, I think I'm just over $110 now. But be it as it may, I've made a commitment in my mindset that I'm going to write this because I'm ready to do so. These resources, I think, helps stir that and inspire that. And they certainly have for me over the years. And there it is. And hopefully, I didn't PowerPoint you to death, and hopefully, we got some meaningful ideas. Other questions?
So, Dr. Curtis, thank you so much for this. This is absolutely amazing, and I'm learning so much myself, which I greatly appreciate. Um, so we have um, a couple of comments and questions. So
Sure.
let's see. So one, um, have you ever used design thinking to refine concepts or to even identify source ideas? Would it lend itself to this process?
Actually, I've used design thinking in the School of Architecture where I'm the adjunct, but not in business ideas. But there's no reason why it shouldn't work. I just don't know how to take the tool to do so.
It's interesting because I actually happen to have done that in only in a business context.
Hmm.
And we did it. We were working with the Postal Service. And for anyone who's not familiar with this concept of design thinking, I definitely encourage you to take a look at some research on it. But part of the idea is to challenge yourself to change the way you think about a problem. So, for example, we said, what if it became illegal for the post office to deliver mail? And that sounds absurd, but then the question is, well, what assets do they have and how could those assets be used in a different way?
Hmm.
And that generated some amazing ideas of community centers and integrated workforce development locations and things. Um, and so for me, I think that's actually a really, it's kind of a neat one to do. Just it's even just in, for kind of blue sky thinking. Let's
Sure.
see.
During the post-COVID in the architecture design world, everyone started to ask the question that are we or have we really designed the spaces for everyone?
Hmm.
Because all of a sudden you had a clean slate. There was nobody in the museum, nobody was going to the dining hall or whatever the venue was. And it really pushed people to sort of rethink, well, how can I design the space in a way that people feel comfortable again? It's not something that many of the design or architectural people even gave any thought to.
That and I have been if any I would encourage everyone, and if you're living in the Washington D.C. metro area, if you haven't been to the Building Museum, the National Building Museum in the city, it is amazing, and they do some really cool talks about things like that, about
Yeah,
human scale environments, the built environment, and love their programs. So that's
absolutely.
very cool.
Great.
Um, so a question here about, let me see if I can summarize this. So a lot of times companies, they're active on social media, they're a small business, and they look amazing. Like basically, I think the question is, can you kind of get your marketing ahead of where you are in your business and product? And what are the risks with doing that?
So I where I've seen this quite often that and this supply chain issue in the last year or two has really hit a lot of startups because of that. It's not, and it's nothing that they could have controlled, but all of a sudden they've got a bunch of commitments to deliver a bunch of goods, but they can't get them produced. And so that was something that was a global impact. And before COVID, before supply chain issues, where I've seen it more times is people over promising and under delivering. And
Mm.
I prefer the other side, under promise and over deliver. That's when I think your best bet. It's that you're sort of like the snake oil salespeople during the Wild West. You drink this, and all of your woes will go away. Clearly, that was never the case. And but definitely have seen cases where the other big issue I think I've seen probably more often than other are entrepreneurs who don't understand the importance of putting a team together to get their idea to work. And they want 100% control 100%. And I've often told people 100% of zero is still zero. And you've got to get to the point to where you need to share the idea. My dissertation focused on social entrepreneurship and wealth building strategies. And in it, My proposal was all startups should hire individuals and give them a piece of the pie as part of their compensation. And if you're wildly successful, everybody will be wildly successful and helpful. But 100% of zero will always be zero.
I love that, and that's something I think is Generation Z and our millennials are really motivated differently in business than what we've seen in prior generations. And I know I see that in my company, even though we're a huge, global big tech company. Um, it, they're really looking to have purpose in what they do and make a difference and be
Yep,
connected to the business that they're in. So, and I think startups, I mean, you literally get to be there at the ground floor. So I think that's an amazing opportunity for all of us, regardless of your age or generation.
absolutely.
Um, and you touched on, we have time for maybe one more question.
Sure.
And this is my own question. And you just touched on social entrepreneurship.
Hmm.
We've been talking a bit more about more of the traditional business and for-profit side,
Hmm.
but on the kind of social entrepreneurship and nonprofit side, I've been involved in my background with some social entrepreneurship type of companies and organizations. Um, but I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you view entrepreneurship being different, or is there anything different
Sure.
in the way that you would get started if you were looking at starting a nonprofit versus a for-profit business?
Um, Sort of yes and no. So, slight plug for the Mentor Capital Network is a nonprofit. Um, we literally were created years ago. I was not one of the founders. I happened to be board chair, and we facilitate ideas from around the world for entrepreneurs to have access to proven businesses, lawyers, designers, tech people, and most of their ideas are all nonprofit in focus, for profit in intent. And the structure that has evolved, and I'm going to say it's at least 10 years old now, is what's called a B corporation structure. It's a legal structure that allows you to be a nonprofit, but have a for-profit arm so that the money you're making can fuel the nonprofit idea that you're about. And so if you're really interested in how can I really mutually coexist in the profit nonprofit world, look at the letter B corporation tenets, and they're pretty rigorous. But there's absolutely, it's not as either or as it used to be.
That is really cool, and that is actually very similar to, well, not quite similar to, but somewhat like one of the organizations I was involved with. They were digitizing documents, and they
Mhm.
had individuals who were disabled who were purpose trained to do that. And they were not for profit. And this was outside the US, but they were using the revenue to actually pay for schooling and healthcare and other resources for these individuals who
Yeah.
otherwise didn't have that. And it was so inspiring. And that's part of my journey in this in the kind of nonprofit space. So I have to look more into that. That's really cool.
Yeah,
Um,
Social Venture Network is a organization you might want to look into because that's a body of people that have gotten together, and they've done some pretty interesting stuff. And so that's at least another resource.
Very cool.
Great.
So, great. We're at time. Dr. Curtis, thank you so much for sharing your time, your expertise with us. I want to thank Dr. Sylvia Bonatti and Dr. Annabelle Reitman as well, our co-founders, for setting this up. And thank you, Sylvia, for inviting Dr. Curtis. This has been such an amazing session. We look forward to having more, and hopefully we'll be able to invite you back at some point for some additional conversation. So thank you. With this, we're going to wrap. And please, though, feel free to engage with our website, 55 plus plus entrepreneurs.org. And if you have any further questions or follow up, feel free to send us an email as well. Thank you all so much and have a great day.
Thank you.